Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second part with Kassra. And yes, we just took a little look into your childhood and youth. Now, the clicking life is starting a bit, but I would start again with a critical question. Topic guilt, not what the murder is about. We will deal with that later. But do you also see guilt with the parents, guilt at school, or do you say no? That is all my decision, or in childhood, do you say, okay, here some are to blame?
Good question. I don't find it critical at all. I just think it's right. Yes, I think one has to differentiate. There are several stages of life that I have there, and they also go through chronologically. And I think one has to distinguish between childhood and being a teenager and being a young adult. The childhood burdens the child anew with guilt. The child is a product of his environment and his perception of what he is presented with or not. Therefore, the child bears no guilt at all. I also say this in the conversations when I sit with teenagers sometimes and their parents have spoken, I tell them you just have to understand that the children are 100% dependent on you, but also the product and the development of your upbringing. Because then parents always ask why he doesn't work and does this instead. This is also the misbehavior, non-behavior, or mistakes made by the parents. That also happens, we're all human. I am definitely on the topic that the child is 100% free of responsibility. It's a child, even as a teenager. And that he is growing up incredibly here. Of course, and it never takes the person out of responsibility in later age. I've also had some criticisms occasionally. I don't even know where. But now it's always the parents, everyone else is to blame. No, also for the people out there to understand. Especially when you are at a point where you reflect on yourself, self-realization is a very, very important point to also understand yourself, to develop self-understanding. That does not mean that one absolves oneself of responsibility for the actions that one has also committed oneself. But in order to also take a step out of this mindset and out of this negative behavior in life, you have to understand yourself, you have to develop self-understanding. You can only do this if you reflect on yourself and try to work through your entire development and develop a certain understanding and also understand where the problems were, what was missing for me, in order to then also maintain the status quo that you have now worked out preventively. Because if you are not aware of your own mistakes and your own deficits, you always make the same mistakes and always end up in the same situations. Because you don't even know what you're missing. So how do you want to be preventive for yourself? If I know I'm choleric or I can, for example, I would react aggressively to large crowds. React. I don't understand why I escalate conflicts every time I'm in large crowds. But if I know for myself, hey, I can't handle large crowds, which is not the case with me, but as an example, then I simply avoid it. If that's the case, it means developing self-understanding and getting to know oneself, which unfortunately many people don't do. And that's why I differentiate between childhood and adulthood. And of course, let's say from the non-legal, responsible, and justiciable area, where you can then also take legal responsibility humanly. I think from 18 upwards, you can already say you are responsible for your actions and know more or less what you are doing to a certain degree. I do not exempt myself from responsibility. And says, my dad is also to blame. That's why I've now beaten you half to death or insulted you or started selling hash or something like that. Of course not. My father didn't put the hash in my hand, didn't sell it, or didn't say, stab that boy or something, but it's simply the trauma that took place in childhood, which led to this process being set in motion and you then developing in this direction. Nevertheless, you take responsibility. And I also tell this to the boys and children when I had the conversations, always saying, you are still responsible for your actions. We do not absolve you of responsibility. Nevertheless, creating an understanding is the development. And then, of course, the parents have, of course, also failed because they have the responsibility. And, of course, the error search is clear there. And, of course, the mistake lies with the parents.
I also think that it's not an excuse, but it serves the understanding when people deal with it professionally or even families themselves to see which paths were set, which mistakes were made.
That is a realization that
is very, very important. And that's supposed to be the added value here on the channel, to understand why such a young man who has so much potential, who actually didn't grow up in poverty and then of course has the ability to cognitively process it and so on, why then this is his life path. But now comes the first click. You're in secondary school. I don't know, what year are we in now approximately? You're 37 today.
yes, I think it was around the turn of the millennium. And 99, 2000, that's the period I believe we're moving through now.
And what's really exciting for many, even those in social work, we have many of them here too. This is a phenomenon for many, because I ask this question quite often. You asked how I chose such a far-right group and how such a clique forms. You have said that then they were Russian Germans.
Mostly Russians and Turks, yes.
And that's the interesting question. How does such a clique form? You're now going to the main school, you're there, and then I also like to ask this question to students in social work or whatever. How does such a clique form? Well, there's no stake anywhere that says, here stand the outsiders.
Or a club today, the problem children are meeting.
Here in the
room 125, 3 o'clock?
No, I understand.
No, just kidding. I just think, of course, the kids also have antennas, and kids naturally understand that they have problems. They just can't define it 100% what the problem is. But with kids, it's always the others who are to blame. And this also applies to adults. This is also true for children and young adolescents. They often have extremely pure intentions, at times even purer than adults or other people. And they notice that. And, when he always gets kicked out of class 1A and has problems and has his issues with the teachers in the class, and in class 2C and in class 4C, just to give a bit of an example, things, and then always somehow cross paths. They, of course, notice that, and then they have the same sayings. Then you saw this point teacher, and yes, he also with me, full this, and what is this, and blah, 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 and back and forth, and whatever else always comes in terms or expressions and such. They then find each other quite automatically. They then meet in front of the school and then have the same lack of drive in that direction, and usually pull each other down, and then sometimes carry out things from a group that you would not have done as an individual.
It's not rocket science, but many people don't understand how it works, how outsiders or others do so.
Fine, that
is very exciting for many. And in this now high school, secondary school, short guest appearance, primary school, what is the mood? Rejection clearly evokes certain emotions, but I won't presume to name them for you. It's apparent what they are. What emotional cocktail is there? I don't know.
How I felt back then, I can only say. Or rather, what I remember, certainly also anger, rejection, hate. It's all such a cocktail that builds up there depending on the situation. But I think on the whole, I was just lost, completely lost. Like on a lost post. I hung on the ropes, falling from one corner to the other, then hung on the ropes again. In the blue, red, green, and black corners. Until then, only a ring and a light were passed between construction sites with school and problems in between. The issues manifested in a way that affected both my school and personal life. There were the first fights, the first reports, the first legal problems. Yes, I have to slow you down there. Yes, but that was the emotional state. I think that there was more, like, even if I now try to put myself in there, try to empathize a bit, I think more like that the main emotional state, I believe, was more like lost. I believe that you were more like lost there and didn't have to go anywhere at all. What's with you and what's actually with me and what's happening here right now. Because so many things happened in such a short period of time. You didn't even know them. You didn't have this experience at all. And I believe you were completely overwhelmed and totally lost. You just acted the way you reacted.
And I believe it's already difficult for adults when they feel like, I'm somehow lost here, I'm lost in my life right now.
That is.
Yes, for children.
And teenagers.
Especially difficult. Now, you've said that almost so casually.
First acts of violence.
reports, but when we talk now, we're talking about you don't start as a violent person and immediately beat someone up, what I half dead. Then at school, it came to violence, or in the private area with the gang. So
I
understand a bit more precisely than now.
Yes, sure. So chronologically, I can't say what was first, the first fight on the schoolyard or outside anyway. It starts then in school. And then I also had fights. I had fights outside of school. Then we stole cell phones in school. They were on why we stole and enriched ourselves with things we didn't have ourselves. Yes, despite where I was of the opinion, I would like to acquire this, but I can't get it for whatever reasons. And then you were outside, stole something, or started smoking weed, had the first points of contact, one in the group, then suddenly rolled a joint and you didn't know what it was. You joined in, you were involved in that topic, then you bought drugs, which is illegal today. It was illegal back then. I can't say now what happened where first, but that was the situation. Those were the first things that happened in my life. And of course, these were also things that were completely new to me, but that also acted like a valve, I believe, a valve in the sense that I then defended myself and then supposedly, I believe, became master of my situation again, because I then had the opportunity to defend myself. Because I believe as a child in that situation, I was more exposed to things that I could not influence. As a child, things happen that you can't influence at all. You have no way of influencing them. For you, everyone else is to blame, and you are the one who suffers. And that was the first time it switched, and I said, okay, or rather had the feeling, okay, I've hit him now, I've taken something. I'm defending myself now, and in whatever way, and get what I've been missing for the last 3, 4, or 2, 3, 4 years in a way that, of course, is also good.
So you've triggered me super hard. It's one of the perennial topics because in my story and with many extremists, there's always also the feeling you've said several times now, I've defended myself. And for many, that's a feeling also in crime or in extremism, I'm defending myself. I'm defending myself against my parents' house. I'm defending myself against school, against society. I don't fit in here. I'm defending myself, yes.
Only.
And maybe a completely different jump to it now. Do you think there could have been a chance if you had met a clique to radicalize yourself? So in this phase, would you have been susceptible to it if you had found a community that said, man, Kassra, come to us, here is family, here is cohesion, we explain the world to you and we defend ourselves against all these systems that have also harmed you?
Yes, kind of 50-50. I've never, despite my clique, I've never always been like, I had phases where I was a lot in the group, then I had phases where I didn't feel like being in a group, but you can't rule it out. At the end of the day, I also ended up in such a radicalized group. It's not politically radicalized, but criminally radicalized in the sense of a criminal organization.
Yes, and right at the top.
And right at the top of the food chain in the world. And even radiates out in the structure itself, but we'll get to that later, for sure, I think. But I believe it's a 50-50 thing. Of course, it didn't happen at that time, but if someone had come along, let's say a particularly religious fanatical group or an extremist group of any kind, I can't rule it out 100%. But I can't deny it either, you know? I can neither confirm nor completely rule it out. I think it's a 50-50 thing.
But
the possibility, of course, existed.
There is the fascination of violence. Was it the same for you? What did the exercise of violence give you?
I still remember situations where I would briefly recall individual situations, how I felt in the first 1, 2, 3, 4 violent situations, and I never wanted that. It was always an uncomfortable situation because it was a conflict situation and it always carried negative things with it in the situation and of course afterwards. And I still remember when I had the first situation, I actually didn't want that. So it didn't give me a good feeling because it always brought problems with it, and I somehow also knew, okay, this is not so cool. But, and this is very important, of the more often such situations were, it turned out that I realized, okay, this is not so mega cool, but I can assert my interest with it. As you've already triggered both, where I said I can defend myself because everyone else is stupid and shit and I'm the one who's being trampled on, and now you're getting to know me, so to speak. And yet it was again so positive in the sense of, but I can then defend myself so well. Because I think at that time I was no longer able to defend myself in a communicative way and to say, hey, what's this shit? Why doesn't anyone come talk to me? I wouldn't have given you one, or something like that. Which of course is not at all true to life. But yeah, so
Have you grown from your violent acts? Did it give you a feeling like, okay, now I am, so I'm going to make a leap now because we have a lot of parallels, but I don't want to talk about myself like that today because
it's about you here.
but without getting too close to you, you are somehow a failed teenager with these school changes, down from the gymnasium with a lot of potential, down to the main school. What then suddenly, okay, then I am suddenly the school bully. I make my mark in my little quarter in Norderstedt. Was that then
Always.
Still, did you then also define yourself through violence, or was it just a means to an end? Okay, I want to snatch a phone here, or both, a mixture.
Both. I think at some point I then accepted that for myself. Then I take on the role to one, then lick my ass, and I go the way. Now it's not cool. It's not cool. That's how it is. It brings problems with it. The police comes, mother and father, even more negative than it already was once with the development that
One is recorded at home police, yes, my
parents, my mother has asked first, what is there? What's going on and why? And again, what is this? Why don't you do it? My father doesn't even do it anymore. My father has always taken himself completely out of these whole topics to 95% and can't at all. He doesn't feel like it at all. It was too exhausting for him and doesn't work. His daughter is a hardworking, independent high achiever who completed her high school diploma while working. So I focus on him, and yes, she should do it there, and I'm not interested. But it's also important, it has to be said very clearly that this was a special situation in my family. My father carried a lot of emotional baggage with him. I believe his development in childhood also did not take on such positive traits. And I am of the opinion that he has a very severe narcissistic personality disorder. And unfortunately, he has not been able to work through it because he is not so aware of it and has thus brought it into our family circumstances. There is a definition for this which is very important to me, as it varies from place to place, you know. And therefore, it was like this. There is a psychological definition for it. So it's a term for this boy-father relationship, which can tip over into son toxic. And that the father, who has this narcissistic personality disorder, is used to Narcissus wanting attention, wanting to take place, is used to getting this 100% attention from his counterpart, in this case the woman. And then the first child comes along, the daughter, he doesn't feel that he's not getting this attention anymore because it's a girl. From the moment a male counterpart is born into the family, son and the mother then, so the attention escapes the nature of the automatically, at least 50%, if it's good, 50% benefits the other, the child, in this case the boy. That's how it turns. The father subconsciously feels he's no longer getting the attention the boy now receives.
But with one's own child, I would understand it if the woman, that is...
It was intense, but I only understood everything later. That's when I was able to comprehend many things and why he did what he did. So that's why he always subtly saw me as emotional competition to his wife. As I said, there is also a medical term for this. Unfortunately, I can't remember it. I have already, this is not exactly common, but you can gladly Google it. I'm not making this up now. And therefore, I have also played through everything with the psychologist, and therefore that was the situation. So this is not just a father who didn't care, but he did take care of his daughter, but I was completely gone. Because this situation, jealousy and not functioning according to his definition, and that is such a real toxic cocktail, which then leads to it actually getting worse than it already is.
I'm now letting out the pocket psychologist. Yes, please.
I just did it no differently. Novice. Forgive me. Even the psychologist watching will explain it better, but that was my layman's understanding.
Getting attention in a positive way didn't work. maybe the idea, okay, if I'm not seen in a positive light, well, then maybe I'll get attention in a negative way. Is that
Conceivable? Exactly. As I said, that's then also where I said, okay, now I take on that role, then you perceive me that way. And that's how I'm perceived.
so along the lines of, okay, you see me as the failed evil child anyway, you can have that.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. That's the perfect description, I believe, yes.
And you guys are now hanging out as a clique, like out and about. Okay, police, you're hanging out, or what's that? Like not at home? Yes.
Rarely home, constantly coming and going, truant, always on the move. There was a youth home back then, a youth house. It was called the Bunker Nordostig. Greetings at this point. I think it still exists, but it's different now. We were there. They gave the young people the opportunity to have a place where you could meet, where you could play foosball, where you could play. They had a large outdoor area. Then we had a communal kitchen. We were there. Then we bought food. Back then, there were still cheap pizzas for 1 mark 50 or €1.50 at Spar. And then we were there vegetating and loafing around, just being with each other. That's how you met others as a teenager. I was a teen. You then met other people, including boys from outside your school who weren't as biologically German as you. Not Iranian or Chilean migration background, but Turkish migration background. And those are the boys with whom you grew up and went through certain stages of life together, positive and negative.
Did you also get to know older ones? Because it's quite common when the father figure is missing or as said does not work, is not there, or is toxic. Did you also look up to others? Now, teenagers, it's enough if a 14-year-old looks up to a 17-year-old or to an 18-year-old, or didn't you look for that?
That came a bit later. When I made this switch from school, I was eventually kicked out with a leaving certificate. Until I ended up in such a container, it was very, very difficult to educate children. And there I didn't argue with the teacher. I then had a physical altercation with the teacher because he insulted me to the max. So for me, he surely wants to have a different perspective. And greetings at this point, sorry again for the situation a few years later.
But what does that mean? So a physical confrontation?
Well, everything was lying fallow with me. You were also kicked out of secondary school because I was hardly there, skipped many days, had been beaten up, and they said, hey, you also disturbed the class, was regularly kicked out. And then it was said, I am no longer bearable for regular teaching, and a facility was created for this. These were construction containers in Richtweg at that time. This is a subway station between Neue Stadtmitte and Garstedt. And then they put 3 or 4 containers on such a large lawn and created teaching spaces with 2, 3, 4 teachers. There were 3 or 4 boys who had also completely failed. That is, in the phase they were in, they had completely failed academically. And they were just thrown in there and they wanted to teach them somehow, but of course that didn't fit and didn't work.
But I also have to say, even in the Justice Vocational Academy, Bützow, there was a container in between. You just feel shitty in there. Even as a prisoner, you feel shitty in that container. But when you're already being stuffed into containers as a teenager, you somehow already know, okay, I'm here somehow, now I'm really here, now I'm really here.
This is the end of the line, and so it was. That was the end of the line. And accordingly, I didn't do anything there. It was a quarter of a year, and of course I was also upset. I was extremely upset. Everything is awful, and I've lost it all. I was completely unfeeling. That's a bad term, but totally out of order. No longer recognized any authority, nothing at all. Even my parents, hardly at home. And then the teacher, as I said, classic, the teacher said something, I reacted to it. And whether I was right or not at the time, as I said, it then escalated into a physical confrontation from my side, proactively, unfortunately, at that point. And I threw a set square at his head, which was so hard, it was a relatively new one. It stuck in his head for a few seconds and he bled heavily, and that was the end of it. My entire school career ended abruptly at that moment. I then left with my leaving certificates, so with nothing at all. And yes, that was the situation with school and development.
And you were probably even celebrated for such an action, right?
Yes, of course, the guys in there were ha ha ha, and you know how it is. They then push each other. And of course, that was the worst case of the worst cases, the worst cases. And then it was the end of the day. That was clear to me as well. So you didn't feel like it at all. You drive there, arrive in a container and think, what's this? Am I here now? And you can't just say, okay, I brought this on myself. For you, it's like wondering what they want from you now and what the number means.
What would you say to the teacher today if you ran into him? Yes, that it's first of all for me.
I'm sorry that he, of course, didn't deserve to be treated like that. And I obviously, as a young teenager, wasn't in control of my whole situation. And also, yes, simply, that is, of course, simply a mistake on his part, the treatment. I believe, I of course don't know, this never justifies violence against a person, no matter what he says. And therefore, it was fundamentally a no-go to throw anything at his head. And as I said, I was no longer completely sane at that point, but then technically completely out of order in terms of behavior. Therefore, of course, I feel sorry for him. I hope he was, of course, also a human being. He is, of course, also a human being. And I hope that this has not negatively affected him in retrospect, working with students.
It's a harsh level of reflection, so that's always, I once saw your first video at Hyperbole, which is also a few years ago, where I then said it's also due to the brevity and I was also still in development. Yes, well, that's how it is. Yes, but that's exactly the level of reflection, and that's what I wish for many who then drop out, no matter from crime, extremism, violence, doesn't matter, to even think about it, that you just commented on it, to say, okay, how has this affected your life afterwards? How do you approach it afterwards?
Students go,
I never thought about the worry or fear I felt when driving to school in the morning. When I punched someone at school, people would tell me about it afterwards. After 3 years, I stopped taking the same route to school. It was a one-time thing for me, and I just moved on. I think great.
And I think I have to, of course, also learn that. And I think such a change of perspective is very, very important. And therefore, I hope that it didn't negatively affect his teaching career in retrospect, and that he couldn't work with students anymore or treated a certain ethnicity of students badly who looked like me. That does something to people. I hope at this point that he either continued to be a teacher, that the teacher professionally, career-wise, still continued his path and also drew his lessons from it. Maybe he also became the second one to go to fight. Of course, that doesn't justify it, but maybe he also drew his lessons from it and, of course, wishes him wherever and hope he naturally still experiences the best, that he didn't draw such a negative impact from it. Of course, there are intermediate phases, but the first next big step that is worth mentioning is then I went to Iran. My father then came up with the idea, instead of sitting down with me and dealing with me, he said, I'll send him to Iran and we just take away some of his options here, reflecting what he has here and what he doesn't use but only does shit. And what options he has in the country where I come from, and they are not so cool.
Yes, it makes me feel really bad when I hear it. So it makes me really... Yes.
Yes, and that was so pedagogically valuable for him, and he said, well, now I'm going to shoot you down.
What does Mom say about that? How did he do that?
Naturally carried along. My mother is also a burned child, a home child, and of course holds on to everything she has. There are two types of home children. They are traumatized. Just a brief interjection to create understanding for such personalities. These are likely home children who are severely traumatized. Traumatized children, they completely either are people who allow zero closeness, zero attachment to other people, because they simply do not want to allow this disappointment of rejection and do not want to get hurt, or they hold on to people no matter how bad and toxic the relationship is and just cling on with all their might.
To everything.
My mother was the latter, of course. She went along with everything my father wanted. She occasionally intervened, but when my father was adamant about something and slammed the table, she would back down. However, that's already a step forward, I must say.
Iran, so I'm already dealing with politics, world politics. Iran, of course, always a difficult terrain. Yes, of course. And as for your human rights, the whole region, it is...
Not just Iran, the whole region is.
At what age is it decided? I imagine you're at home saying, Kassra, you're not doing well. We're tired of the violence and issues with the police. You've messed up at school, so off to Iran you go. Yes, or what?
Yes, that's the gist of it, yes.
What did you say? One would have said, had I said here.
I don't feel like it, I'm not doing it. especially since I didn't know the Maoris, the language, as well as I could, as well as I can today. Or can today. Yes, but it did happen. I did not avoid it. Where should I go?
What can we do now?
We are now between 13 and 16. That's the range we are in.
Then it was decided they flew over with you? Yes.
They flew over with me, bought tickets. Back then, there were no sanctions. You could still fly directly from Hamburg. I then flew over from Hamburg with the airline, 5-6 hours. Then I arrived there. It was like a huge family. And I was with his youngest sister, my aunt. And then a few days later, we drove 5 hours by bus to the region where he grew up, to his birthplace. The birthplace is about as big as, I don't know, Lübeck, Kiel, or whatever. And it's a medium-sized city, and I was there, dropped off by my grandma, God rest her soul. She has since passed away, and I lived with her.
And then you were gone?
He was gone, then took care of things in the environment. He still cared, said, he's here now. Why is he there? Of course, I didn't notice that, but that's logical. It's clarified. Then made sure that I lived with my uncle by marriage. So that's my cousin's husband. How do you say that, uncle? By marriage or whatever? Define.
Let's just define it like that.
Exactly. Unimportant. In any case, it was my cousin's husband, and he had a store. He had a sell everything kind of store, like a Turkish supermarket dealer, like...
A consumer, yes.
He worked at a store that had everything: meat, shampoo, spices, sweets, like the ones in Hamburg Steinland. The owner told him, you are working here now. You get money paid out from him. Yes, then I sit there, can barely speak the language. Yes, I sit with my grandma, communicating with hands and feet. Being linguistically inclined, I quickly learned the language. So. So much so that I was really on the move and could do my thing there. My thing, yes. And then I worked there. I stayed there for an extended period following a routine.
And when you think back to that time today,
basically, of course, it's a complete disaster to deport me. But of course, it has broadened my horizons. But
do you see that at all now?
Of course not. This is all retrospective right now. Back then, if you mean the ones from back then, disaster. I was born in Hamburg. Here everything is known and open, free, so according to our Western definition, European definition, it is also free. And then I come to a country where women have to cover themselves, not because they want to, but they have to, otherwise there is a penalty. In this place, men and women are separated. Women board the bus at the back, while men board at the front. A woman is not allowed to hold hands with a man in public and be out and about if they do not have a familial or marital relationship. It is punishable by law. You're not allowed to drink alcohol in public there. Alcohol and drugs are banned, which is a good start. But these are all the things that have happened there. You are not allowed to have a girlfriend. That was already said. And politically, there is a morality police there. So it's everything. It's a complete break with everything, you know, from home. Very political.
Very
different. And of course...
What was your father's hope? Yes, now, yes,
He also said his understanding is you are now first getting to know life over there and what options you have here that you don't want to use. Now I'll show you how it is where I come from and what opportunities you don't have there or which you do have definitely. So, and have fun, so to speak, and then drop me off at the beginning. It was the first 2 weeks. It was like an adventure. But then it was like, okay, you're really here and now you can't get away. Now you can't get away. It's not a vacation. Not a vacation, an older cousin scene.
Were you told you will be picked up again? You are...
Now, here for now, just do it for now. You have work here now, you live with your grandma, have your room, take care of your grandma, and just do it here for now. It wasn't school either, I just got up and went to work.
Did you find friends there?
I had briefly the boys will know this, who grew up here and then drive to their family, for example, Turkey. You are a foreigner there, and sometimes here too, you then feel like a foreigner from certain musts.
The German...
But the German, so also a foreigner, you are accepted, but I was then rather so. Yes, Iranian culture is a very hospitable culture, also experienced by the family, but it is, of course, also very, very superficial and sometimes also very dishonest. It begins with communication, however, they are extremely hospitable and warm-hearted. But when you really go deep in such a situation occurs, I was then pressed on the eye. There was no real connection to me. I was there once, twice on vacation with him, but that's nothing at all. I was there, and they have to work with me. They were told that it's a problem and it doesn't work. Well, and there in Iran, you are only defined by performance. Every second person studies there, everyone studies, goes to school. So there is only Professor Mohandes, as they call it, professor, lecturer, teacher, I don't know.
I was just about to say, I believe the main export from Iran to the West are doctors.
Are doctors and engineers and architects and all that stuff. Unfortunately, many architects' degrees are not recognized in Germany, forcing them to become taxi drivers. While an honorable job, it's a stark contrast from their field of study.
But I believe that is changing now. We have many Iranian doctors.
Yes, of course, but still. The level of education there is very high, completely different from other places.
And
When people arrive and it doesn't work, they wonder what he wants now. If he can work at his own home, how can he work here? He's unable to spare. But they did it. As I mentioned, my grandma made an effort, despite not being fully satisfied with the situation, and accordingly, I then bumped into here and there, yes, and then I didn't really make friends there. I was always interesting. The German who comes from Germany. Can you give something? Can you give us money? Can you do this for us? Or do you have something? Or show me something? Who is he anyway? This curiosity about the person, about these circumstances was there, but as a person, they were not really interested. And now comes a very important point. But a very big but, that's where I met my uncle. That's my father's younger brother, the middle one, who has since passed away, God rest his soul. Shortly after that, I left again. He was a very special personality. His approach towards me was the complete opposite of my father's. For the first time in my life, despite it being hard for my father to hear, I felt I had a father figure, and I believe he knows this deep down himself. He was a chunk of a man, yes, like Bud Spencer, really the Iranian Bud Spencer, incredibly empathetic, incredibly kind, incredibly responsible towards his children. He has 2 children.
You can already tell when you talk about him.
Yes, he was also incredibly attentive, empathetic, and incredibly self-sacrificing. And he was then a city architect, employed in the city, shaped half the place in the buildings and in parks and everything built. Did a distance learning course in parallel, which also exists there, and then recommended himself for the mayor's office and so on. And this whole struggle, he had 2 children, a family to provide for, and then he took me under his wing, took care of me, drove me into the mountains. Everything that boys find cool at that age. So my kind.
Seen to
I was seen by him. He talked to me about sex, development, puberty, drove me into the mountains there. We shot wild, stayed outside with me. We talked there. He talked to me.
held me in his arm.
And said, boy, I love you. He said, boy, I love you. Let's go. And what? How are you? Everything. Okay, come, my boy. Went with me to the sauna. Had a drink here and there. I just say it nicely in North German here, as they say. Lifted one, it's forbidden, but he didn't care. He lived his life and taught me Persian, reading and writing. He came home at 9 in the evening. I was at his house, always sat between him and my grandma. He looked at me and said, come boy, we sit down for half an hour. I teach you Persian, Arabic. Persian is a different language, but still the same alphabet, and taught me the Arabic alphabet and looked at me, taught me to read and write, and I could read and write.
And then torn away from him again, right?
Of course, I didn't get rid of my packages overnight, but it was really intense, and that was an experience I will never forget it in my life. That person was very special. But after some time, I couldn't handle it anymore and wanted to leave. I couldn't stand it anymore. I put a lot of pressure on my family and even had a confrontation with him. I rebelled then, I argued with him, and then I put so much pressure that they said, Father, come over, you have to pick him up. It's not working anymore. He's going under here, going crazy and causing problems. Then he said he's bringing him back now. And then I went over. Shortly after I arrived home, not a few weeks later, I received a message, a father's message. My father was also hit hard. He had a very close relationship with him. He was a person you had to love.
That's such a person.
Yes, and unfortunately, he was then in a traffic accident with the graduating class, with which one then passed his high school diploma. Then it was decided to make a trip to Iran, a 3-week one. Iran is a multi-ethnic state, extremely rich in culture, extremely rich in history. Anyone who is interested in this culture knows what I'm talking about or Googles the country. Iran has a rich and extensive culture beyond just the Islamic Republic. And even the Iranians don't know every place in their country. And there's everything from desert to mountains to snow to green. And they said, come on, we'll do a tour of Iran and want to see our own country and take a cultural trip. Sadly, they fell from the mountain. They were driven by a driver heavily under the influence of opium and was not able to at night. And due to his narcotization or his high, he then fell off the mountain 50 or 100 meters. And half of the passengers, there were 30, 40 men, died and the other half survived. Crippled, broken, nothing happened. Unfortunately, one of the dead was my uncle. And that emotionally hit me very hard at the time, and not just me, it also pulled the rug out from under my father. And I never had such a person in my life again. You can tell by the way I talk about it, and...
So, you can feel it, you can feel it. I think Thorsten can too. In my life, I also had my Aunt Brigitte, who meant everything to me, who also passed away 2 years ago.
Who for a lifetime
was there for me. Those are such things. But nice that you got to know them anyway. Even if they are torn out.
And they still left their footprints in life.
Left behind. Just now already. Maybe with you as the last question on this topic. Because the topic, especially when it comes to crime or extremism later, I always try to build a bit of a bridge. Have you ever felt loneliness in Iran? Yes, of course. Just non-stop, sure. It does something to you, right? Yes.
I then functioned somehow. I also had fun with my cousins. We played and they gamed. They also tried to engage with me. I would be doing them an injustice if I said I was rejected. That was not the case. But nonetheless, they had a different mindset. I am a boy shaped by the West, probably very decadent for their understanding. They don't have the material standard of living that we have here in Europe, especially in Germany. So in comparison, yes. And probably I have been for them here and there, maybe even came across as arrogant. But that wasn't because I was simply used to something different. And as a child, you can't do that yet. Okay, now I'm going to step down. Mom has continuously relaxed. And yes, then it's just a cheap drink. But no, it's not original cola, for instance.
You know.
And that just didn't exist back then. Despite this, they always tried to amuse me and lift my spirits. We then went to the game of Floor, where we played Sega Mega Drive from 1994 onwards, even though we were already in the PlayStation 2 era. They didn't have that, which was totally charming and sympathetic, but that's just how it was. Despite this, our interests differed. They prioritized academics, while I sought companionship, wondering where my friends were.
I still have to push something behind. That means if you have also had this experience of loneliness or something, after that the jump, then especially back in Hamburg, then group again. Now I'm glad to be back in Hamburg. Now I need boys around me again.
Yes, of course, because this need is also fueled by this abstinence, and that's how it was for me. This feeling of powerlessness and impotence, which you are then also exposed to, because you couldn't drive to the airport and fly away yourself. I didn't have my passport, so it wasn't possible. I also didn't have the opportunity. And the need to go back home, my old environment, my old people back and forth, kept growing. Because I learned the language, I worked there, it was fun, I had a lot of cool stuff with my uncle. Just now I saw him dearly, you notice. It was an extremely awesome time, and it was very painful to lose him there. Even to this day, when I think about it, even now, it's a wound that I believe will never heal when you were very, very close to a person, meant a lot to you. You learn to cope, but the scar lingers. But still, for me, I still had the need, grew more and more back into the old clique, back again. For me, it wasn't wrong, I was accepted there. For the first time, there was recognition and acceptance of who I was and my situation. So it wasn't negative for me, but always negative for the others. And accordingly, the need grew more and more. And instead of turning away from it, it pulled me back in even stronger.
It's a great added value for people who are also involved in this work, especially when it comes to working with teenagers adolescence. Thank you for your honesty. The emotions are palpable not only in the video, but also here when you tell that. So still many thanks
for that.
Your openness. We are in the third part, then it starts in Hamburg. I believe now it's also starting, now the high-speed journey begins, also into crime, also into the red light district. I believe could trigger a bit. So
many thanks, Kassra, for taking the...
Thanks for your help and time, Torsten. I really appreciate the depth of our discussion. Guys, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you in the third part.